Okay, what I want to talk specifically about today is surrealistic or just realistic illustration. How do we take things that are without form, that are flat, and make them look like they're three-dimensional or they have form in Photoshop? And the reason why we're talking about this early on in the semester is because these principles of what makes something look like it has form or makes it look flat can be applied to designs in a myriad of different ways. And once we understand this principle and we understand how to manipulate images in Photoshop, it transfers over to a lot of other things that maybe have nothing to do with illustration, but it will make you see things differently, and it will make you a better artist, a better designer, better at layout. So it's an important skill to have. Just happens to be that we're going to focus on how do we make something out of nothing look real. And let me show you some examples. So these are not real objects. These are just some illustrations I did quickly in Photoshop. This is meant to look like a little air freshener, right? And this is a microphone that's kind of on a black glass table with a reflection. We're actually going to go through an exercise today, and I'm going to teach you how to make this microphone. It's relatively simple. But I want you to identify a few things about these images that make them look real and not like clip art. The first one is there's tons of shadows and highlights. Shadows, highlights, reflections, things like that, they create weight. In life we have, in order to see something and to understand its form, we have to have a light source shining on that object. The big light source for us outside is the sun. We know the sun comes in different directions as it moves throughout the day, and that casts different shadows and makes things, the form of things change slightly. So if you wake up in the morning and you look at your house, one side of your house might be very light, one very dark, and something in the middle. And at the end of the day, it might be just the opposite, right? So when you have a light source, you're going to have parts of your object that are highlighted, that are closer to the light source or are getting more intense direct light. Parts that are further away, and we call that shadow area. We also may have a cast shadow if we only have one light source, meaning kind of a reflection of the object that's being cast onto the ground, right? When you walk, you can see your shadow. And those things are probably the most important elements in creating form. Now there's other things that we can talk about I don't have up here, one being texture. We'll go through that in our lesson. But if we just did shadows, highlights, and mid-values of everything, it would give us the illusion of form. And we all probably took an art class sometime in our life where we had to draw a ball or like a can or something like that. And we had to shade one side really dark and then lighten it up, and the other side was really light, and draw a little shadow on the bottom. It's the same principle, but in Photoshop we don't have to use a pencil. We don't have to have a steady hand. We don't have to have our hand and our arm turned lead colored from rubbing across the page. We have gradients, we have airbrushes, we have ways to smudge and blend and blur things. So we can be very precise and make things look very, very real. The gradients and transitions, this is when we take one color or one value to another. It can be light to dark, it can be red to blue, depending on the material, the color of the material, the size, the shape, the characteristics of the material that we're trying to imitate will give us that direction of how we want to create transitions and gradients. The last one is irregularities. Oftentimes when we're doing things like doing an illustration, we have to think that in Photoshop we could make it absolutely perfect. And we know that in real life things aren't absolutely perfect, so we have to try to sometimes dumb them down just a hair so that it looks more natural. An example would be, in my industry, if I'm talking about making a rendering or an illustration of an iPhone case, if every single edge and every single line were perfect on it, it actually wouldn't be a full representation of reality. Reality is that when an iPhone case is made, it goes into a big mold. If it's a hard plastic case, we have a mold that injects plastic into a cavity. The cavity pops out, they pull it out, and there's little pieces that are attached to it from where the flow of the plastic goes that have to be cut off, depending on how long it was cooked, who handled it, and things like that. Sometimes you can get little irregularities and imperfections that you probably wouldn't notice if you just picked it up. Two cases would look identical, but if you took a photograph and you really got detailed in on it, you might see that the edge is slightly sharper or slightly more blunt on one or the other, And when we see photographs, we naturally assume that. When we see illustrations that are completely perfect, that's one of the telltale signs to say, I bet that's a rendering. It's just too good. So when we're doing this in Photoshop, we want to create some irregularity, right? This packaging, if this was completely straight, you see there's a little bit of wavy in it. If it were completely straight, it would look more like an illustration than like an actual package. Here's an example. This is just a quick illustration I did a long time ago that all I did was I took a piece of clip art and then I started to add shadows and highlights over the top of it to make it look like a real car. Now it's not perfect, and if you zoomed in on it, you'd see that it's nothing to get excited about. But I just wanted to show that you can take something that is very flat and just start to shade it, and very simply and very quickly. This does not have a lot of layers or detail. You can have something that looks like it has form and character. So that's what we're going to go through in class today. And the easiest way for me to teach that to you is to have you guys open up a document, me open up a document, and just start to work on something. The first thing is you have a file called ball that I'm going to have you open up. We've talked about this, I think, in our beginning class originally. I don't think we've talked about creating a ball like this in this class, have we? Okay. So this is a common thing that you see. It's on websites, it's on packaging, whatever, to have these three-dimensional kind of plastic-looking shapes. It might look like a pill or a ball or a rectangle, kind of a button. And how is that made? And it's actually quite simple, and so I'm going to run you through that. And it's just assigning values to highlights, shadows, and midtones. So to make this, I'm just... What?
Sorry, do you mind sending that file over here?
Sure.
Sorry.
What number you want?
6.
6. All right, so what I'm going to do is just have you open this document with me. I'm going to create a new layer on top of it and fill that layer with white. I'm going to make sure white's my foreground color, get my paint bucket, pop it in, and that basically is just going to create like a piece of paper on top of my image so that I can, I don't have to throw it away, but I can kind of work on something from start to finish here. If you come over to your layers palette, or sorry, your toolbar over to the left, you can select a few different tools that will give you a circle shape. I'm just going to do it the real easy way, which is for me to click the marquee selection tool, go to elliptical, hold down shift and drag a selection of a circle. I'm going to make a new layer and I'm going to fill it with a color. And that one I made was blue, so let's do kind of a red color for this ball. Get my fill tool and pop it in. Question? Yes. I hope I am. Let's see. Yes. No problem. Okay, so I'm here with this red bullseye. The next thing I want to do is create a highlight. And a highlight can be created in several different ways, but the easiest way is to use an existing shape so that we have a nice clean edge and then a fade edge. And that's a characteristic of plastic. A plastic kind of reflects like glass. So if you had the sun or you had a big light in a studio or even a light in here, the plastic would reflect a kind of a mirror image. It would be distorted, but of the light, right? When you look at somebody's eye, they have a little glint in it. That glint is always a reflection of the eye, of the light source. In fact, if you look at a photograph in a magazine, you can look at the model's eyes in the photograph and you can tell how the photographer lit the photograph because you're going to see those lights in their eyes. There'll be a circle light or a big soft box or whatever. So same thing with plastic, it's just reflecting the light. So in this circumstance, we can do it several different ways, but an easy way to do it is to use this circle shape. So I'm going to go and get my selection tool and make a new selection, hold shift, of a smaller circle. And we'll say that's the light that we're going to reflect on this button. I then create a new layer. I get white as my foreground color because white is going to be the reflection of light. And then I come over here to my toolbar and I go down to my gradient tool.
We're going to use lots of gradients today. My gradient tool brings up some options at the top. Right now it looks like the last gradient I used was a custom gradient, kind of an orange to a yellow to an orange. If I click on it, up here at the top, it always gives me a few constants. One is a black to white gradient. One is my foreground to transparent. And the other is whatever the current colors are down here. In this case, it's black to white, so it's repeated itself. What I want is to go from white to transparent. So I just go ahead and click on that gradient here in my presets, and that will always be there. Whatever your foreground is, it will go that color to transparent, and I click OK. Then if I come over here to my gradient tool, I make sure linear gradient is selected in my options. Take my little crosshairs, hold it down, and let go. Question?
Sorry, how did you open the gradient manager again?
So once you've clicked on the tool and you have this up here, you just have to click on the square, or sorry, the rectangle. And that will open up the gradient editor. If you click on the triangle to the side, it'll just show you what's available, which in this case would be fine. But the editor we're going to use more today, so I want people to get used to clicking that. All right, so now I have a faded white to transparent circle on top of a red circle. I'm going to go select, deselect. And you can see it's beginning, actually, just even that simple step, to look a little more three-dimensional, right? Yes. All right. From here, I may want to add some character around the edges. I may want to have some shading or some dark spots. So if the light was shining on this and it was reflecting back around some of the edges, because they're further away from the light on a dome, right? If you can imagine a cross-section of a dome, this part close to the light, this part not as close. So I can kind of darken those edges, and a quick, easy way to do that is to go to my layer effects. I'm going to go to the FX and go to something called Inner Glow. Now you could also do this by selecting your circle, getting a black airbrush, and kind of painting around it, but it would be hard to make it uniform. So when I go into my Inner Glow, it's automatically set to screen in yellow, which would be more like a light, airy glow. In this case, I want to use that to darken my image all the way around. So I change it from screen to normal or multiply and go from yellow to black. If you haven't done this before, oops, and I am on the wrong layer, my bad. Do it on the layer of the red. I apologize. So red, FX, Inner Glow. Change it from screen to normal or multiply will work. Yellow to black. And you see immediately how it puts a little faded black rim around my object. If I just grab the size and pull that up, you see how that starts to create some deep detail. Now that's really dark. If I don't like it, I can pull the opacity back here at the top. But using that Inner Glow on my object gives me very consistent fade, whereas if I used an airbrush, does that make sense? If I selected it and took a paintbrush and tried to airbrush around it, it'd be really hard. I'd have to have a steady hand, and I would get some have some areas that are lighter or darker than the others. Then the last thing I did to make this look a little more plasticky, right now it looks pretty good actually, right? Is I made a little bump reflection. So then I made up that term. But if you can imagine, if you had a plastic glass sphere, a light hitting it, so coming in at an angle, which is represented by this, it would go through the sphere, hit the table or hit whatever's behind the sphere, and then it would pop back out a little bit because it's kind of transparent, right? So it hits and then it leaves. So where it leaves, we can put another little bit of a white spot to show that it's a little bit lighter there. And you'll see this gives it an illusion of transparency.
How did you get the shadow that thick?
On the shadow, you can go to your size here and adjust it up or down. And then, of course, the opacity will make it darker or lighter. So make sure you're on Inner Shadow. Don't do Inner Glow. Or sorry, Inner Glow, I'm sorry. You don't want to be on Inner Shadow. That will only make it come from one side.
I'm not seeing all those other options online.
Okay, so you can actually click on it.
Okay. Okay.
All right, so once you're here, I create a new layer. I get my marquee selection tool and make sure it's an ellipse, same as a circle. And I draw a little flying saucer here and let go. This one I go ahead and I fill it with white paint. So where's my paint bucket? I go select, deselect, and then I blur it. Filter, blur, Gaussian blur. Blur it just a little bit, and then I usually go in and adjust the opacity, pull it way, way down. And some people like that, some people don't, but it gives you the illusion that this is kind of more transparent. Light coming in, light leaving.
So, what did you exactly do?
I just made a little fuzzy flying saucer. I'll do it one more time. Click a new layer. Drag out a little flying saucer with my marquee selection tool. Fill it with white paint. Select, deselect. Filter, blur, Gaussian blur. We only use Gaussian. Blur it up as much as I think I need to blur it. Click OK and then adjust the opacity. And again, that's not a necessary step, but it does give it a little more definition. And then if I look at my image here versus where we started with the blue, they're very, very similar, right? And that suddenly becomes a three-dimensional, more realistic image. Now, if you wanted to do it on a peel shape, you just make sure that your reflection mirrors that shape. So instead of being a circle, we might want to extend it to the sides. Or if we're doing a square, we lop it off as a square or a rounded rectangle. Does that make sense? Okay. Now I want you guys to open up energybar.psd. What I want to do here is take something all the way from flat clip art looking graphic to something that looks a little more realistic, as a real candy bar sitting in a wrapper. I'm going to name mine the Kent bar. You can do whatever you want. I'm just going to go ahead and get a type tool and type in my name and put it on top. Get a different font. You don't have to name yours. It can just be no name brand. And I think I'll take my name and make it bigger. And I might even rasterize it so that I can kind of hold down my command key and kind of stretch it so it fits into this little polygon or whatever this thing's called. So that's my Kent bar. You could do the same thing or leave it, and I'll go ahead and merge those layers together. Okay, so how do we get this to look real? We've got to add shadows, highlights, and mid-values. The first thing, though, is, remember I talked about irregularity? You see how perfectly crimped each end is, and the side is exactly straight? That's going to give it away. So we need to figure some way to make this junky. And one quick way to do it, and this isn't the only way, but you can go into your filter menu and choose an option called Liquify. Who's used Liquify before? A few of us. If you click it, what it basically does is take you into a menu where you can grab paintbrushes of different sizes, and you can use different techniques over here to kind of skew, bulge, squeeze, mess around with pixels in an image. So I'm just going to use this first one, which is called the reconstruct. Oh no, sorry, not reconstruct. My bad. First one, there we go. What do they call this? Let's see if it comes up. The forward warp tool. And basically this allows me to grab pieces of an image and kind of pull them around. So if it's somebody's face, I could make their nose extra big or eyes or whatever and not have it would look real. It just basically kind of explodes pixels. Now I'm going to come over here to my bar and I'm going to click and I'm going to drag out some areas and I'm just going to kind of junk up. Let me go ahead and zoom in on this so you guys can see it a little bit better. I'm going to junk up and create some anomaly in some of these little crimps. See what I'm doing? Just by pulling and dragging, I'm trying to make this look less uniform and a little more varied in the way that it's put together. Now I could get a bigger brush if I want and make an even bigger dent. Let's see. You see how that pushes that whole part up? Incidentally, when we work on some photo sweetening, this is a great tool to make people less fat. So you can imagine, I actually had a picture of me that someone took today. We were just messing around at work, and I had my phone in my back pocket, and it looked like I had a third cheek in back. And so we grabbed the Liquify tool and got rid of it. All right, so you can spend as much or as little time on this as you want. I think that's probably good. Okay, so we've created some anomalies or some imperfections. Okay, so that's the first thing that we did. The next thing we need to do is add some shadows and highlights. Traditionally, the way that we would do this is by doing dodging and burning. Remember last week when I talked about that briefly, that was the photographer's way to darken or lighten colors in an image without just adding black and white? I told you that the part that sucked about that was you had to actually work on the image, and I had kind of created a workaround using an overlay layer. That's what we're going to do right now. So instead of dodging and burning this graphic and maybe making a mistake or not being able to adjust my opacity or whatever, I'm going to create an independent layer, one for dodging and one for burning. To do that, I need to create a new layer, but instead of just clicking it like I just did, I want you to option click it like we did last week, which brings up a little dialog box of how we can name and adjust the layer. And we're going to go from the normal mode to overlay, and we're going to fill with neutral 50% gray. Can anybody explain to me why neutral gray? Does anybody remember that? So what happens is in the in the overlay mode, everything that's darker than 50% gray, it will deepen the color of your object. Everything lighter will lighten, and everything that's 50% gray will be, it won't do anything to it. It'll just leave it alone. It kind of treats 50% gray as neutral or transparent. So if I click OK, you notice over here in my layer stack, I've got a layer that has gray in it. But because it's set to overlay up here, you don't see it because the gray is considered neutral.
I see mine.
Yeah, ours turned gray.
Did you change it to overlay? Okay. Oh, did you turn your background on? Your white background?
That's it.
There you go. Sorry. You're seeing it like this, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's whatever it interacts with, it neutralizes it. But if there's nothing to interact with, then it shows. Sorry about that. Good catch. All right. So now I'm going to get white and black paint, knowing that if I paint on this layer, it's going to deepen a color or lighten a color. I'll start with black. I'll start with my shadows. I'll get a paintbrush, and I'll make sure it is a soft paintbrush because that's more natural, right? We don't want a hard line. The shadows shouldn't look like they were made with a marker. And then I'll get a size that gives me something that you'll see in a second makes more sense for kind of a shape of a candy bar. I'll say 30. Okay, and I'm going to come over here. I'm working on an independent layer, and I'm going to draw a shadow of where this candy bar would be sitting in this package. And to do that, I just hold down my Shift key so I make a nice straight line and drag. Oops, I ran out of space. And then if I want to hit it again, right now I'm at 41%. So let's put that up a little higher. We'll go 80 on my opacity. If I want to hit it again, it will darken it up even more. And as long as I hold down my Shift key, it keeps it in a nice straight line. So can you guys see a difference there? And see, it's not adding black, it's actually deepening the color, the value of the color. Now if I want a much harder black line, I'm going to go ahead and put the opacity at 100. I'm going to make a little bit smaller brush. So now I kind of have this nice even weight here. And I might just go along the edge and darken that up a hair more. Oops, you might not be seeing that as well on your screen. But then I can come around and I can do a little hand painting. So I'm just going to come into that area and do that. I'm going to come up here to the top, a little bit bigger brush, hold down shift, and drag across the top as well. Now that one's a little too deep, so I'll just undo, pull my opacity back, drag across the top. Again, I'm holding down shift. And so I'm just going to manually start to paint in some little dark areas. And I don't have to be great at painting or a great artist to do this. I'm just choosing areas that I think there might need to be a little shadow. Maybe here. So I'll hold down my shift key, make a shadow there. Over here where the candy bar ends, same thing. And then I can kind of hit some of the corners a little harder. I like to get a little smaller brush in this particular tutorial and draw some lines coming out here of where it may crimp. Same thing over here. Okay, immediately it looks more real, right? Before, after. And that's just the shadow portion. So now we need to add some highlights. Highlights I'll put on their own layer by clicking a new layer, holding down Option, choosing normal, overlay, 50% gray, okay, white, paintbrush, and then I'm going to come right along the top of the shadow, because if you can imagine, we're looking at a cross section of a candy bar here, right? My hands kind of indicate that. Down here at the bottom, this would be the part that's dark and shadowed, but the rim of it would be the closest part to the light, and so there might be a little bit of a white line or a little reflection there. You'll see as I come here, I'm going to click and drag across. Oops, I went a little too far, so I didn't undo. Okay, and then I'm going to do the same thing right here, and do one right there. I'm going to come in and paint a few little more highlights here on some of these edges. And I'm going to pull my opacity back just a little bit and then do one right there. And maybe another one. Let me hit that a little harder. Alright. Now, because it's an independent layer, I can adjust my opacity. So you guys tell me when it looks good. I'm just going to start to tease it up. More or less?
Less.
You go right there? Okay. So immediately my thing starts, my candy bar here starts to look a little more realistic, right? Another thing I can do in this is I can add a little shadow. So where it says can't, I'm going to command click that layer, which gives me a selection of it. So anytime we have an object, if we command click the object in the layers palette, it gives us a selection. A new layer, put it behind, and I will fill that layer with black. So now I have underneath my candy bar basically a black silhouette of it. From there, I can Apple T it, and I can hold down any of my, I'm holding down my command keys, and I can create a little bit of a shadow off to the side, however I think makes sense. And then I'm going to blur it by using a Gaussian blur. And then I'm going to pull back the opacity and then resize it again because it's still too big. And you see how that kind of adds some weight?
Can you show us how the creation of that layer again one more time?
Sure.
Thanks.
So new layer, going to command click my candy bar. So I have a selection, black paint, paint bucket tool, fill it with black, select, deselect. Then I did an Apple T, held down my command key so I can just kind of offset the black so I can see it a little bit. I'll come back to it. Filter, blur, Gaussian blur. So basically making a blurry black image. Click OK, pull the opacity way down, and then Apple T, readjust that to something that looks more natural. Yes.
When you command click, how do you get to get the candy bar? Because mine keeps grabbing like the shadows.
Okay, so you got to make sure you're on the right layer. So you see where my hand is right here, it's touching the candy bar. When I command click that, it will select it. If I come over here to the shadows, see how it's, well, it's grabbing the whole thing because it's got everything on that layer. But yeah, make sure you're clicking the right layer. All right, now there's a couple other little things you can do with this if you want to get tricky. I'll just show them to you, but it's not required. This layer that says Kent, I could copy that if I wanted and use a filter, and this only works in some cases. Since we have a really shiny surface, there's a filter, I think it's under artistic, called plastic wrap. If you click it, it gives you a bunch of little kind of plasticky looking things. You see all this here? This is just a little extra. You don't need to do this. So I copied my layer, go into plastic wrap, click OK. You see how it gave me a bunch of that stuff? It's not good all on its own, so I'm going to pull it back a little bit. But I can pull it back, get a big soft eraser, and tap out some of it and leave some of it in. And it just creates, again, a little bit of some areas that have some anomaly here with the shading and a few extra highlights. But I don't think that's a necessary step. Just throwing it out there. So pretty simply, I know there was a lot of steps there, but pretty simply, without a lot of artistic ability, we can take something that is presented flat and give it form and weight. So if you owned a candy bar or a power bar or a protein bar or whatever factory, and you had a website and you wanted to put some images on there but you didn't have your product done, you could take the graphic that your graphic designer gives you of what the package is going to look like. You could fake it, put this on your site, and probably fool people, right? Especially if it's small. Okay? So this is some of the power that Photoshop gives you, but even more than that, it's the power that you have in using light, dark, and mid values on things. So as we start to think about form, we think of how light hits an object and how the object expresses itself based on the light. So, the next thing I want to teach you guys then is how to make this microphone. Are we up for it? Yes. All right. If you want to open up the file that's called microphone, you will have something that looks like this. I gave you all a little bit of a head start on it, just to save us some time, and that is I put a mesh on here, which is basically just a bunch of crisscrossing lines. If you know how to do this, great. If not, you could always use a line tool. Come in here, create a new layer, drag out a line, copy the layer, keep doing it, then switch them all. Or you could be lazy and just use the type tool, hold down the line, return, hold down a line, select it all, adjust the leading, do a bunch of them, flip them, right? But you don't have to do that. I'm just giving you this one.
Thank you.
Awesome. So I want to deconstruct the mic. Our top is going to look a little bit different than this one, but it will still look believable. Characteristics of this top piece, so this piece that's kind of meshy, are that it has 3 dimensions in that it's got a highlight, some mid values, and a shadow area. It also has warping. Do you guys know what I mean by warping?
It's like curved around.
Yeah, so the mesh is curving around on the corner, so in the middle here, those cells in the mesh are big, on the end they get really teeny, right? And that's called perspective. That's another, depending on what you're working on for like a surrealistic illustration, that's another technique to make it look more real. So we have texturing, perspective, shadows, those types of things. So I'm going to come over here and we're going to figure out how to warp this out. I think the easiest way to do it is to get your marquee tool. So you have a circle, shift, draw a circle around your microphone. Now because we're dealing with all these little lines, like It's almost hypnotic, right, to look at this thing. So we won't spend too much time because it gets a little zebra action in your brain. But we've got a selection now of our mesh. I'm going to go into my filters menu, and under, I believe it's render. No, not render. Distort. There's something called spherize. If I click that, you notice how there's a mesh here, which basically is a representation of how something might become spherized. And as I go one way or the other with the amount, it either sucks it in or pushes it out. We want to push it out. We click OK, and Photoshop automatically gives us a nice spherized effect. Now, if it's not dramatic enough, you can go Filter and do Spherize again. You can go find it through Distort, Spherize as we did, or whatever the last filter was that you used in Photoshop, it'll always be saved here at the top. And so if you want to repeat it, just click it and then we'll run it one more time. Yay! So now we have a spherized looking microphone mesh, but then we have a bunch of mesh that we don't need. So how do we get rid of that? Select, inverse, delete, right? So now we have exactly what we need. I need to now create some shading on this to make it look more realistic. So there's a few different ways you can do it, and again, it depends on how you build your file. But I'm going to go ahead and get a circle. I'm going to hold my shift key, and I'm going to draw a circle that's the same size as the sphere. If I wanted to shift click this, or sorry, command click this, it would only get the pieces of the sphere that are black because it's on transparency. So that's why I'm having to draw another circle around it. Does that make sense? Okay, so I've got my circle. I'm going to go ahead and hide my microphone, mesh, create a new layer, and I'm going to make a ball. And in Photoshop, the easiest way to make a ball is to use a gradient. I'm going to click on my gradient editor up here at the top, and this ball is going to go from black to white. Well, actually, not quite black. I'd rather probably start a dark gray. And then go to white, and then I'm going to use a different type of gradient than a linear gradient. And I forget if it's called a sphere gradient or whatever. I'll show you in a second. We'll all learn.
I think it's radial.
Radial, there you go. If I want to click on these stops, double click them, come down here. You see how my color becomes an option here? If I click this, I can put it to dark gray if I want. I just don't want to be pure black. You can do pure black if you want. And I don't want to be fully white, so I'm going to click on that, and I'm going to put it as a very, very light gray. So I've now edited my gradient. Click OK. Again, you can use white to black if you want. Now instead of coming over here and dragging out a linear gradient, which gives us basically a light, middle, and dark area, I want it to be in a radial format, which will give us a highlight and then a gradient out from the highlight, which creates roundness. So if you come over here, your second option in at the very top on your options bar is your radial gradient. If you click on that and then drag a little line, you don't want to go edge to edge, but maybe somewhere in the middle. Oops, I did it the other wrong way. Oops, doing this the wrong way. I gotta switch my background and foreground color. Maybe what's going on?
So your first click is the center, the radius.
Yes. So why is it? Oh, my mode was on difference from before. That's why. If I gotta switch this.
Yeah, just switch the gradient from white to dark.
Oh, up here.
Yeah.
So go white here. All right. There we go. So it looks like a ball. Now, what I was doing before was just the opposite, right? So one thing you could do as a workaround is if you have the same problem that I had, you could just go Edit, Adjustments, Invert, and then it would do it for you. But yeah, great point. Whatever the first color is where it's going to be the highlight, so that's why it wasn't working for me. Does that make sense? I'm sorry if I confused everyone. All right, so there's my ball. Select, deselect, that's 3D. Now if I put my mesh back on top, you can see my mesh suddenly is interacting with my ball. They're not perfectly lined up, so I'm going to adjust the size of my ball a little bit, make it slightly bigger to match the mesh. Now it's a little dark for me, so I can take that mesh and I can pull the opacity back a little bit to show more of the ball. And I can pull the opacity of the ball back, or I can just lighten it by going Image, Adjustments, Levels, and lightening that up. Okay, so anyways, what we need to do is get some shading that's interacting with that mesh. I'll pull that mesh up a little bit. And I'm going to go ahead and shift click these two layers together. And I could either link them or I could permanently melt them together. I'm going to melt them by just going over here to Merge Layers, just so I don't end up with 7,000 different layers in this one. Let me drag this over. Now the key to the rest of the microphone is really pretty easy. It is creating a gradient that goes black to light gray to a medium black or a darker gray to light gray back to black. And that creates the illusion of a metallic surface. So to do that, I'm going to come over here to my gradient tool, go into my gradient editor. I'm going to go from black, hold down my Option key to make a new stop. We talked about that last week. And I'm going to go to a very light gray, hold down my Option key, make another one, double click it, go to a very dark gray, hold down my Option key, go to a very light gray, and then my last one is going to be pure black. See how I did that? And then I can move these around in any position that I think looks right. You see how that almost looks like a piece of metal right there, just based off the gradient? Is anybody struggling with this? Do I need to review this? Okay, so you're going to go into your gradient editor. We're going to go black, light gray, dark gray, light gray, black. I've already got black, so I can leave that alone. If I hold down my Option key and drag this stop, it gives me a new stop or new area to add color. I'm going to double click it and put light gray. I'm going to then hold down Option again on the light gray to create a new one. Double click it and I'm going to put dark gray. Hold down my Option again. This one's light gray. And then my last one I changed to black. And then once I have these, I can adjust any of these positions if I want, just to change how smoothly or how abrupt the gradient is from one stop to the other. So do we understand how gradients work? You take one color, go to another, go to another, go to another, or go to transparency. Click OK. Now it's just a matter of drawing some shapes. I get my rectangle marquee tool and I draw out a rectangle, a vertical rectangle. Click a new layer. Get my gradient tool, hold down, make sure it's in the linear gradient mode. We just did radial. We want it to be in a line format, so linear here. Hold down Shift, go from top to bottom, and let go. And it creates what looks kind of like a metal band, right? Then I go Select, Deselect. Now I can take this metal band, I can copy it by dragging its layer down to the new layer icon, so I have one on top of the other, right? I'll take the one that's on top and I'm just going to slightly resize it. Hit return. And then I'm going to Image, Adjustments, Levels. I'm going to make this one slightly darker. And what this does is it creates, give me a preview there. It creates what looks like a little edge. You see how there's a little lighter edge here? So it looks like it's a piece of metal that has kind of two levels. Can you guys tell that on your screens? Yes, no? Okay. Click OK. Then all I gotta do is create another layer, get a marquee tool, and we'll build a little piece that attaches to the microphone stem. Drag out a rectangle, get a gradient, shift, hold it down, select, deselect, and then I use my free transform tool, Command T. You know what, I forgot to put it on a new layer. Gosh, I suck. Okay, put it on a new layer, and then drag it out. Select, deselect, Command T, Command T, hold down my Command key. If I do Command, Option, and Shift at the same time and grab a corner, see what it does? It makes it nice and uniform for me. Normally I hold down just my Command key and grab one corner, and that'll still work. But if I do the combination of Command, Option, Shift, it grabs both at the same time. So I can then adjust this to make it look like it's fitting on top of this microphone, the actual microphone part. I'm going to bump back to this to see how I did it. Okay. Next thing I want to do is create another one, drag out another rectangle, get my gradient, make sure it's on a new layer. It is. Drag out my gradient, select, deselect, line them up. Looks like I need to zoom in a little bit here and get this one to match up with that corner a little better. Then I Apple T or Command T again, Shift, Option, Command. You gotta thin out the stem. Hit return. Do one more by clicking on my new layer icon. Get my other marquee tool. Pull it out. Drag out my gradient. Select, deselect. Apple T. Shift, Option, Command. Pull this part down. This is the butt. And then I'm actually going to darken this up so that the butt is a little darker. So I go Image, Adjustments, Levels. Go ahead and pull the levels down on this. Oops. Click OK. I can actually darken or change the tone on this a little bit if I want to. Clicking to it, Image, Adjust, Levels. Lighten it up if we want it, make it a little more silver. Click OK. And then you could go in and add details. You could add some text on it or whatever. But we'll say this is good. So you can see with just using gradients, we can make an image of a microphone or an object or whatever that's got a metal base. We can make it quite easily. Then how do we get this reflection in this little table? That's super easy too. How do you bend the band around the mic? This one?
Yeah, how
Or
would you
this?
curve it? The one on the left.
This?
Yeah.
So it's not curved at all. It's just
So do you just leave that top part?
yep.
Because
So
on the other one, the other mic picture you have, it's like the top and bottom are curved with the mic, I think.
this here.
Yeah.
So what I did in that one is I just made a selection of the mic, and then I actually had it down further, and then I just trimmed out the end.
Oh, okay.
So I went select inverse, went to these two layers. You got an eraser tool,
Gotcha.
and got rid of one, and then went to the other. Let's see, I'm just at 75 there. And if that was moved down, then it would of course respect the angle. Okay, so once I'm here, I want to build a table. I want to build a reflection. I want to put it in an environment. On any I'm a big fan of saving all my layers, right? We've talked about this. I don't like to make permanent changes too often. But I really need this all as one object. So one thing that I do in my workflow often is I will shift click all the layers. So we've got all the microphone layers selected over here. I will click over to this option at the top right of my layers palette, and I will go to an option called New Group from Layers. If I click it, I can give it a name. I'll call it Microphone Original. It takes all those layers, and you see how it put them in a folder for me? They're still independent. I didn't melt them all together. I just reorganized them. I can take this folder now and I can drag it to my new layer icon and duplicate it. I can hide my original one. And then this folder, if I come over here, I can merge group. And it took everything in the folder and made a copy of it as just one object.
How did you do that again?
What I did, so, want me to do the whole thing?
No, just,
Okay, so
just that last part.
we've got everything in here in one grouping.
Yeah.
That's the automated way to do it. I could have just created a group and dragged them all in, or drugged them, or whatever the term is. Once I have them like this, I need to copy it, because I want to basically make a copy and then merge the copy. So I drag that to the new layer icon, and it makes a copy. So now I have 2 folders full of all microphone parts and pieces. I can hide one of them, and then the one that I just copied, I'm going to merge it together. And by clicking on the icon here at the top, I can do merge group, which is Command E on my keyboard, and that just merges it all into one layer. Now you don't have to do that. That just makes this much easier to work with, because I'm going to have to make a reflection of it and everything, and if it's all these different layers, it's going to get a little heady and difficult to manage. So I still have this original that I can use if I needed to start over or I wanted to break it out, but this just gives me basically a composite image to start to finish on. So to make a table like this, I'm going to go ahead and on this image make it a little smaller so we can have a little bigger table. I just Apple keyed it. To make a table or an environment, I'll start by just clicking a new layer, putting it behind my microphone. This will be my background. I'll get like a medium gray color or something to start.
Can,
Yes.
can I ask you a question for a minute? Sorry.
Sorry.
Oh, I'm
Sorry. We had a soccer jersey emergency. That was my wife. So I've shrunk the layer of the microphone, and now I'm going to build a background. Are we doing okay? Am I going too fast? Anybody ready to throw a dart at me or anything? All right, hopefully the video helps. I got a medium gray color. I like to start with a background that's kind of a medium gray. You can imagine if you went into a photo studio to get some pictures taken, they may put you on a gray background, and then that background can be colored later on. If it was black, it would be really hard to recolor the background. If it was white and you recolored it, there would be no texture or anything showing. So gray is a good one. Clicking OK, I'm just getting a paint bucket and dumping the paint in so I have a gray background to start with. Now to make a table, in this case, all I need, if you look at it, is a gradient. This one's from white to black on a darker gray background, right? So if I come over here to my microphone, I can click a new layer. So I've got a gray layer, layer with nothing, and then my microphone. On this new layer, I could draw out a table by just making a selection, going from white to black or to a dark color in my gradients. Let's go up to my gradient editor, create a new gradient. We'll go from white to, I'm going to make this a dark, dark gray, almost black or red. There we go. And then I can just drag out a gradient. Holding down shift, it's a linear gradient. So it went from white to black. Select, deselect. Now that's a little stark for a table, so I'll just adjust the opacity and I'll pull it down so it's a little more subtle. Now something else I can do is I can add some shadowing or some other gradients up here at the top. One thing that's nice is if I just click a new layer, let's see, put it on top of the mic, well, I'll leave it behind actually, behind the microphone. Get black, get a big soft paintbrush. I can do one of those kind of vignetting techniques that we've tried before. This is not nearly big enough, so I'll use my bracket keys. And I can kind of burn the edges a little bit. And I will adjust the opacity of that so it's not too much. And I can kind of adjust the sizing of it by doing an Option T, dragging it off or over, whatever I think looks good. Okay, so I'm starting to build a little bit of an environment. Now, one other thing that might look nice is to have a little bit of a black here in contrast with the white. So I can click another new layer. I could get a selection tool, get black as my foreground color, come over here to my gradient tool and go from black to transparent. Drag out a little bit of a gradient here. Select, deselect. It's too much, of course, so I'm going to pull it back. But you see how that contrast shows off this white highlight a little bit better. So again, to deconstruct this, all I've done is I started with a gray background. I did a white to black gradient. I put it within a shape so that it would have a hard line here. If I didn't, it would have started up here, right? So it has a hard edge. Then I just painted in some little corner shadows, which gives us the illusion of vignetting, which means we have a light hitting the source and the light's dropping off the edges, which creates, it kind of pulls us in. I talked about focus and having a clear focus or clear image. This is a technique to do that. It kind of frames everything in without having a big black frame. And then I just made another gradient going from black to transparent up here, which I can adjust. I can adjust the opacity, make it more or less evident. And that gives me a little bit of an environment to work with. Now the cool part is I take my microphone and I say, all right, if I was to set my microphone on the table, would it set like this? No, that means it's like balancing, right? It would be essentially like, oh. So I need the 2 points to touch. Well, that's easy. I just Apple T it, or sorry, Command T. I'm so used to saying Apple T. Come over here, and I'm going to rotate it a little bit, and then I can kind of drag it down. I'll use this table as my guide and try to get both points to touch at the same time. I'll say that's close enough. Hit return. So now as I drag this down onto the table, that's more naturally how it would sit. Well, there's a couple things that would really help this. One is, on this table, if it's really a glossy or glassy surface, it's going to reflect the microphone. And we see that all the time with Apple, like on iPhones and iPods and stuff, they always have like the reflection underneath. So we need to make that. We also need to add a little bit of weight, and a weight would be a little bit of a shadow where it's touching the table, right? Because basically, wherever the light is, this heavy microphone is going to block some of that, at least where it touches. So the first thing I'm going to do is make those touch points, and they're super easy. You just need to go ahead and get your elliptical marquee tool and draw a little flying saucer where it touches. Create a new layer. Fill it with black. Where's my black? Select, deselect. Make sure that that layer is below the microphone because we're going to blur it, and if it was on top it wouldn't make sense. So now I'm going to go filter, blur, and I can use either a Gaussian blur, which is just going to blur it all equally, or I can try something called a motion blur, which I think we did last week. If you click that, it's almost like adding wind, so it blurs it off to the side or an angle. Right now we're at a 0% angle, so it's just horizontal. And you see how it gets a little more blurry here as it falls out on the edges and it's in the middle, it's darker. That's a little more realistic for me. So I'm going to say OK. And then I'll adjust the opacity a little bit. so it's more subtle. And then I can actually, if I want, copy this by dragging the layer to the new layer icon, holding my shift down, dragging it here. I have to move it up just a little bit. And now I have two of them where they're touching. And that immediately gives some weight to my object, right? Okay. Now the easy part, which is the really cool part. I go to my microphone, I drag it to the new layer icon, so I have a mic on top of a mic. The bottom one is going to be my reflection. And all I have to do is go Edit, Transform, Flip Vertical. I'll hold this for a second. Edit, Transform, Flip Vertical, and watch what happens. Drag that down. I have a reflection now of my mic. Drag it so they're touching. I take my opacity and I pull it back so it's more subtle. We don't want to hit it full steam. And then I might want it to fade off, right, a little bit so it kind of dissipates. I could use a mask, I could do a bunch of stuff, or I could just go ghetto on it, grab a big eraser, maybe hit it at on my opacity, hit it at half steam, hold down shift and drag it along this bottom a couple times, and just get it to kind of tease itself out a little bit.
Couldn't you do a black transparency gradient too?
Exactly, in a mask mode. Yep, that would work the same way. But at the expense of confusing anybody, I'm just going to do this one. Not as much control, but it looks pretty much the same. Then I can zoom out on it, and we have created from scratch something that looks pretty cool, right?
When you did the eraser, how did you get it smooth? Because mine's actually like looking really jagged.
So on your eraser, up here are your options. Are you using a brush that's very soft? So you want to come in here to an airbrush, make sure it's soft. Hardness should be at 0. It may be one of your paint brushes you used from last time. Okay, and then another great thing about this is because I used all these gray tones, as long as I get underneath my microphone layer, so my original one up here, I could click a new layer, fill it with, let's go kind of a blue color. And then go from normal to what, if I want to show through. I could try multiply, I could try color. There's lots of things I could try. And I can begin to adjust that environment. And you get a completely different look. I think when I first taught this lesson, I put little highlights, like little sparkles on it. That can be as easy as getting a little circle, drawing a circle, getting white paint. Let's see, you gotta get on the right layer there. White paint, select, deselect, filter, blur, Gaussian blur, kind of blur a little orb, and then I can actually get a polygon tool and draw some little spikes. Fill that with white. Filter, blur, Gaussian blur. I can grab those little spikes I just created, copy it, rotate them, and make them maybe smaller. Adjust the opacity of maybe one or the other, so they're not all at full bore. I'm going to go ahead and merge all these together by clicking them, coming here to merge layers, and then I can put this little sparkle on top of the microphone and adjust the opacity and or the size. Oops, my keyboard does funny things. Pull the opacity up. And now I can copy this one and put it somewhere else as well. You know, adjust the size. You can start to make these little glints and orbs and things happening in the atmosphere that just start to give it a little different look. That one might actually be reflected down here. And you can just start playing and make stuff awesome. So I think this is one of my favorite lessons. I know there's a lot and I'm talking fast, but once you grasp the idea that gradients, forms, and just some of the shading, big soft airbrushes and stuff are, once you get it, you can just make stuff. And you know, if you take a picture of your friend and it's on a crappy background, or they're dating somebody and they're in the background and then they don't date them anymore, you want to cut them out and make a nice shot, you can cut them out, put them on a different background that you make yourself. Or, I mean, there's just a bazillion things you do. If you sold microphones, you could actually take a picture of a microphone instead of even having to draw one, cut it out, make a little fake environment, make a reflection, and that, you know, that becomes the image of the mic on your website. You didn't have to go to a photo studio and pay a photographer to lay out a piece of glass, set up lights. I mean, there's a million things, and you can take this even much further than I have here. I just think it's kind of fun. I would darken this guy. Create some more drama. Imagine if this was an album or something and you could write blah 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 album at the top. Right? So, questions about that tutorial? Alright, let's jump right into what I'm going to ask you guys to do then. What I'd like you to do is create a flyer for me, which is just basically a one-page. It'll be printed on 8.5 by 11, approximately 8 by 10 inches, so that you have plenty of room. You're not bleeding off the edge. I want it to be an advertisement for something. I don't care what it is. And let me give you an example. If you wanted, I want you to create a photorealistic illustration of something. So if you wanted to sell a brand new cell phone or mobile phone, and you wanted to design it yourself, taking the skills you just learned, you could actually do it. And I'm confident it would not be a problem. If you wanted to make an iPhone, if you wanted to make I mean, there's a million objects you could make. Let's take the mobile phone example. So I want you to illustrate the phone, build some environment, or do whatever you want with it, and create an ad where you're using not only the skills we talked about today with surrealistic illustration, but also just general design skills, so rule of thirds, adding fonts or whatever, and then turn that ad into me. So I want it to be, in my line of work, right, I've got to do stuff like this for iPhone cases, right, and for earbuds and stuff, and sometimes we have to illustrate parts of them or even all of them in similar ways to this. And at the end of the day, I deliver it, and it's got an illustration, it's got a background, it's got text and type, whatever. It can all be fake, and you know, you don't need to do the Samsung Galaxy whatever. You can make one up yourself. I've had students, an easy one that I'll tell you because I don't want you to do is like a golf ball. So they make a ball and then little shadows and the dimples or whatever. You could make a car might be super difficult, but you definitely could do it. You could make the head of a golf club. You could make a watch. A watch is actually pretty simple. So go find a picture of a watch online that's kind of laid out like this, and you just draw all the dials and stuff. You draw the links by making little gradients like we did on the microphone, and you stack them and taper them, and you've got a watch band. So lots of different things you can do. I'm looking in this for you in this assignment to create something photorealistic and then use it in a layout. So it'll be based on, the grading will be based on both of those elements. Is that understood? Be a little more of a challenge maybe than the other assignment, but it'll really get you going. And I think between the Euro collage, the illustration assignment, and this assignment, you're using a ton of tools and a ton of techniques. And then we're going to start to move more into layout, and those will help you with your layouts immensely. You might not do any more illustrations for the rest of the semester, but you'll know how all those tools work, and use them in conjunction with the layouts that you're doing, and I think you're gonna have awesome stuff. So I'm gonna stop this recording. I'm doing terrible today.